Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we're jumping right into episode 16, Peace, Consequences, and Legacy. We're going to be talking about one of the most profound and, honestly, ultimately tragic eras in human history, the immediate aftermath of the First World War. You know, when the guns finally went silent in November 1918, the world was essentially left holding the shattered, jagged pieces of the entire global order. Millions of people were dead, centuries-old empires had literally crumbled to dust, and the victorious nations, well, they were tasked with the impossible job of rebuilding the world from scratch. But here's the big question we're tackling today. How did the quote-unquote war to end all wars actually end up laying the exact groundwork for an even more devastating conflict just 20 years later? Let's dive in and find out.
To really wrap our heads around this era, I want you to picture something for a second. Have you ever tried to do a quick DIY home repair that somehow ended up, setting the whole house on fire? Because that is kind of the perfect metaphor for the 1920s. Think about it. A pipe bursts in your kitchen. You grab some duct tape, try to play handyman to save a few bucks, and before you know it, the whole room is flooding and somehow also up in flames. That's essentially what the Allied powers did. They tried to patch up a broken world using punitive treaties and really hasty borders. It was just a disastrously botched repair job that eventually caused the entire international system to totally collapse.
And the crazy thing is, they were totally warned. Back in 1919, French Marshal Ferdinand Foch looked at what was happening and boldly declared, "This is not a peace. It is an armistice for 20 years." Which is just absolutely chilling when you realize that exactly 20 years and a few months later, World War II kicked off. Foch saw right through the whole illusion of resolution, and really that sets the tragic narrative arc for our explainer today. The peacemakers didn't actually solve the world's problems, they just put them on a really short timer.
Section 1. The Paris Peace Conference. The Big Four try to rebuild.
So the stage for this massive global repair job was the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. This gathering was completely dominated by the victorious Big Four powers, the US, Great Britain, France, and Italy. But here is an absolutely critical flaw right from day one. The defeated Central Powers, especially Germany, were completely excluded from the room. They weren't invited to negotiate a peace, they were just there to receive a dictation. And even among the victors, there was this massive glaring contrast in what they actually wanted. On one side, you've got US President Woodrow Wilson with his famous 14 points. He's pushing this deeply idealistic vision for collective security, free trade, and perpetual peace. He basically wanted a peace without victory. But on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, you have French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau. France had been absolutely devastated by the trenches, and Clemenceau demanded what historians call a Carthaginian peace. He wanted the settlement so brutally punitive that it would permanently cripple Germany's economic and military future, ensuring they could never, ever invade France again.
Moving into Section 2, Punishing Defeated Germany, the Treaty of Versailles. What ultimately emerged from this clash of visions was the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, and this treaty became the absolute cornerstone of the post-war settlement. It was an incredibly humiliating and devastating blow to the new Weimar Republic in Germany. Far from Wilson's whole peace without victory idea, the treaty stripped Germany of 13% of its European territory and literally all of its overseas colonies. But the real linchpin here was Article 231, which became notoriously known as the War Guilt Clause. This clause legally forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the entire war. Now, impartially speaking, this was a specific legal mechanism. By forcing Germany to admit total guilt, the Allies established the legal precedent they needed to extract massive financial penalties. But domestically, oh man, in Germany, this sparked immense unified outrage. It was viewed as this profound, unforgivable national shame. And those financial penalties we just mentioned, they were staggering. The initial figure set for German reparations was 132 billion gold marks. At the time, that was roughly 33 billion US dollars, which translates to well over $500 billion in today's money. Now, British economic expert John Maynard Keynes actually attended the conference, and he passionately warned against this. He argued that squeezing this kind of immense, unprecedented wealth out of an already broken Germany would fatally compromise not just the German economy, but the entire economic recovery of Europe. But, the politicians were largely driven by immense public demand back home for revenge, so they pushed it through anyway. Alongside that economic ruin came total military neutralization. Germany's army was slashed to a maximum of just 100,000 professional soldiers. They were strictly forbidden from having any air force or any submarines whatsoever. Their navy was reduced to a measly 6 battleships.
And actually, rather than hand their formidable capital ships over to the Allies, the German Navy famously scuttled, or intentionally sank, their own fleet at Scapa Flow, just to deny the Allies the prize. They also had to completely demilitarize the Rhineland, which created a physical buffer zone for France. So basically, Germany was effectively stripped of its ability to even defend itself.
Section 3. The Shattered Empires. A wave of decolonization in Europe.
Now, let's zoom out to the broader geopolitical map for a second. The immense stress of total, industrialized war didn't just defeat nations, it entirely shattered centuries-old dynastic empires. We saw a massive wave of revolutionary upheaval sweep across the map, fundamentally redrawing the landscape of the world. 4 massive empires simply vanished into thin air. The Austro-Hungarian Empire completely splintered into Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Austria, and Hungary. Over in the east, the collapse of the Russian Tsarist Empire gave birth to an independent Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states. And both the Ottoman and German empires were just completely carved up. Now, while this did create a lot of new nations based on Wilson's high-minded idea of self-determination, the reality on the ground was, frankly, a mess. These newly drawn lines ended up trapping massive ethnic minorities within artificial and highly unstable new borders.
Section 4. Redrawing the Middle East. Imperial Shatter Zones.
Which brings us to one of the absolute most consequential outcomes of the post-war settlements. Following the total collapse of the Ottoman Empire, a massive power vacuum opened up across the Middle East. And rather than fostering true independence in the region, Britain and France essentially used the newly created League of Nations mandate system to rubber stamp their own colonial ambitions. France was handed the mandates for Syria and Lebanon, while Britain took control of Palestine and Mesopotamia, which we know today as Iraq. What makes this era so historically complex and tense is that there were deeply conflicting wartime promises at play. You had British guarantees of Arab autonomy made to counter the Ottomans, sitting right alongside the Balfour Declaration's promise for a Jewish national home. And time again, these promises were just overridden by great power politics. These artificial mandate borders completely ignored local ethnic, religious, and tribal realities on the ground, laying some deeply problematic foundations that absolutely continue to influence conflicts today.
If you want a story that perfectly illustrates the sheer audacity of this era, you have to look at Prince Faisal. So Faisal helped lead the famous Arab Revolt and successfully established a regime in Damascus. But when the French arrived to claim their League of Nations mandate over Syria, they literally drove him into exile by military force. But the British didn't want to lose a valuable ally in the region. So what did? They literally just picked Faisal up and installed him as the brand new king of their newly created mandate in Iraq in 1921. And they did the exact same thing for his brother Abdullah in Transjordan. It was quite literally a great power chess game being played with entire nations and millions of lives. Section 5. The League of Nations, a toothless watchdog.
Okay, so with all this chaos, who is actually supposed to be keeping these great powers in check? Well, that was the job of the League of Nations. This was Woodrow Wilson's massive, unprecedented attempt at creating genuine global governance. The goal was pretty simple on paper: provide a diplomatic forum where global disputes could be settled with words, not in trenches, to ensure a worldwide conflict could never, ever happen again. We actually have historical records of their very first council meeting in January 1920. But there is a massive tragic irony looming over that moment. The United States Senate, deeply hesitant to give up any sovereign war powers to an international body, ultimately flat-out refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and that meant the United States never even joined the League of Nations. America abandoned the very organization its own president had championed and designed.
When you compare the grand vision of the League to the reality, the structural flaws are just glaringly obvious. The vision was all about collective security, disarmament, and open diplomacy protecting every nation, big or small. But the reality? The League lacked any real enforcement mechanism. It didn't have its own military to back up its roles. Furthermore, it required unanimous voting to take any major actions, which effectively paralyzed it any time someone disagreed. Combined with America's total absence, the League ended up being a watchdog with absolutely no teeth, completely powerless to enforce the very treaties it was supposedly built upon.
Section 6. The Road to War. The House Collapses.
Let's bring back our botched home repair metaphor for a second. The Allied powers tried to fix the leaky pipes of a broken Europe with punitive, emotionally driven treaties, artificially drawn borders, and a structurally flawed League of Nations. And as we move into the 1930s, the duct tape peels off, the pipes burst, and the entire house starts catching fire. Just follow the timeline here. The weakness of this post-war order actively emboldened aggressive expansion. In 1931, Japan invades Manchuria. The League criticizes them, but does absolutely nothing to stop them. In 1935, fascist Italy invades Ethiopia. The League tries economic sanctions, but they're completely ineffective. By 1936, the Spanish Civil War becomes a testing ground and proxy conflict for rising European dictatorships. All that deep resentment over the harsh Versailles settlement, combined with the utter failure of collective security, directly paved a smooth road for Hitler's rise. By 1939, that fragile international system collapses entirely and World War II begins.
The First World War technically ended in 1918, but the peace constructed in its wake clearly, undeniably failed. The decisions made by a handful of men over just a few months in Paris reshaped the modern world, often with incredibly devastating long-term consequences. And I really want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. How do the artificial borders, the harsh economic punishments, and those flawed, toothless institutions created back in 1919 continue to shape the political instability and the global conflicts we are still seeing in our news feeds today? The war to end all wars didn't end conflict at all. It simply set the stage for the rest of the 20th century. Thanks for exploring this deeply impactful history with me today in this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you in the next one.